just bear with me. Things are a little weird technical side. I'm just trying to sort everything out before I get started. Okay, so apparently yes. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Hi, Lisa for Truth. Good to see you. Um, so everyone, I last week actually on let me sorry, let me get started over again. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Um, for those of you who aren't familiar, my name is Kevin Mears. I'm a demonologist, paranormal investigator, and the titular Paranormal Encyclopedia. Um, I'm trying to get on doing skip videos at least once a week again. Like, work continues to be crazy, so we'll see how it goes. But actually, I got invited to an event called Iron Garden. It's a monthly event that happens in Newark, New Jersey, at a club called QXT. It's the second time I've actually spoken there. They're a really wonderful group of people, um, and I was delighted to speak. But they actually gave me a chance, one, to talk about my about demons more specifically. Where the first time I spoke, I actually spoke more about vampires, and more specifically about a subject I find really fascinating, particularly because of how misunderstood it is, which is the subject of the demoness, I should say, I suppose, Lilith. Lilith is a really interesting figure to me, just not some both because of the role she plays in and to some extent Christian folklore, but the way that she's changed over the years, and the fact that lots of people today know her story, or at least they think they know her story. And like so many things you learn when you study mythology or folklore, or religion for that matter, because you could argue that she's all three. What people think they know is largely modern. Yes, the most popular modern version of the story is that Lilith was the first wife of Adam. Supposedly, God created Lilith and Adam at the same time from dust, and then the problem comes in when Adam wants her to submit to him. More specifically, Adam wants to have sex from the top. Yeah, in some versions of the story, it's specific. Many versions, I should say, it's specifically that Lilith won't do missionary style. Um, she walks out of the garden. God sends angels to bring her back, and that's a story that most people know. And this has turned her very much into a feminist figure, for refusing to submit to a man. I've got nothing against feminism, but she's a really terrible feminist icon, in my opinion, for a couple of reasons. For a start, what most people think they know, the story I just told, which is the one that probably everyone listening who knows Lilith at all is thinking of, isn't anywhere in the Bible. Certainly, it's based very loosely on the difference between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, where in Genesis chapter 1 it says God created man and woman, and then in Genesis chapter 2 it talks about God breathing on dust to create Adam and taking a rib from Adam to create Eve. And one way that this has been explained relatively recently, and we're going to get into that in a minute, is that, well, Adam had a wife before Eve. Even in some stories, he had two wives before Eve. The first being Lilith, the second one arguably not even being named, but created right in front of Adam's eyes, and the whole process was just so disturbing to him, he couldn't touch her. But here's the thing, and this is one of the points I want to make. Doing some research into this, because I talked about Lilith and about her history and her origins. I'm dang it, now I'm blanking on the name. At the end of Iron Garden on Friday, and I was doing some research because I'd heard this story, but I had thought that it wasn't actually the original story, and it turns out I was right. So I did doing some research in Jewish sources. What you find out is that Lilith's originally seen as simply a demoness. She's the mother of many demons. She's what Christians would certainly call a succubi and the mother of succubi. She's a killer of children. She's a wrecker of homes, but she's not really associated with Adam. She's not associated with being at one time human. Or in the oldest stories, the oldest references to Lilith are Old Testament. I mean, Isaiah 34:14 actually mentions her. In the Hebrew, it mentions her more or less by name, though most translations translate it differently than that. Let me see. It's by no means the best translation, but it's one most people are familiar with, so I'll use the King James. As soon as I can find it, because I have a webpage with a whole series of translations. Here we go. King James. The wild beasts of the desert shall meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall crave for to his fellow, and the screech owls also shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. Now, the name translated here as screech owl is actually Lilith. It's Lilith without the H in the Hebrew. And it's actually referring to this demon, not merely a screech owl. It gets translated a couple of other ways. Night creatures, sometimes night demon, and aside from that, there's references in the Babylonian Talmud to her. Apparently, Shabbat 151a says, "It is forbidden for a man to sleep alone in a house lest Lilith get a hold of him." It was believed that she fertilized herself using male sperm to give birth to more demons. What's interesting, to me at least here, is that, like I said, originally she isn't actually the mother or the wife of Adam. She's simply this demon. The idea that she was the first... There was this idea that Adam had a wife before Eve. This goes back much further. There was also a belief that Adam had been the father of a number of demons. And these two ideas got combined together and added to this demon known as Lilith, which is where we get this modern idea. To give you an idea how late that comes in, the first mention of the story of her is her by name being the first wife of Adam is from a book that was written in the 9th and 10th century. I don't remember the name of the book off the top of my head. I'm trying to find it. Give me a moment. It's called the first version of that story is in the Alphabet of Ben Sira. Ben, Bensira. Which is a collection of stories. It first appears there, sometime 9th, 10th century, and then gets expanded in a book called the Zohar, which was written in Spain in the 12th century. It was an important book in the Jewish system of Kabbalah. It's also the one that identifies her as a wife of Satan. But this is really where it comes about. The story of Lilith as a demon figure, as something to be feared, is older than the wife's story by over 1,000 years. Actually, references to it in pre-Christian texts. But here's the other thing I find interesting is if you trace the origins of the idea of Lilith, she's still a demon. The oldest references that are thought to something like Lilith is from Babylonian and Sumerian and general Assyrian mythology in a being that was, or a group of beings actually, that are known as the Lilitu. Lilitu. Lilitu wasn't a single being, it was a classification of demonic spirit. They took the form of women, they attacked men in their sleep, they had sex with them. Very much the modern idea of the succubi. And this is a large part of probably where the Jews got the idea for Lilith. On top of that, there is the figure of Lamashtu, who was a Babylonian goddess and one of the darker Babylonian deities. Because a lot of it's a common belief among Christians, particularly, that Babylonians worship demons. It's also a Jewish belief because the Bible basically says as much. Well, it's not entirely accurate. It's not exactly wrong either. Their gods tended to be very complicated, often both being gods of very positive things and gods of very negative things. A perfect example of this is a demon that most people listening to this probably know, at least from the movies, which is Pazuzu. Pazuzu, from, of course, the Exorcist trilogy, is a Babylonian god. He's not a pleasant Babylonian god. He's the god of disease. But he's also known as, in Babylonian mythology, is known as a protector of children. Mostly he protects children from Matsu, his wife. Which is kind of this thing, and this is the reason why it really bothers me when people make Lilith into this feminist figure. Because if you go back to the mythology of Lilith, and I don't just mean the mythology before she gets turned into the first wife of Adam, but even in the stories about her being the first wife of Adam, she kills children. Jewish, Lisa Virginia says Jews worshipped El, Baal, and Asherah. Judaism's relationship with polytheism is really complicated. Something for another night. Folks who are interested, go check out Lisa's for Truth's channel. She's done a number of videos on it. Depending on the period, actually, very much a lot of the time the Bible was written specifically, Jews seem to be more henotheistic than anything else. Polytheism is the belief that there are many gods. Henotheism is the belief that there are multiple gods, but your tribe, your group has a god, and you worship your god, not everybody else's god. You'll notice, for example, the first commandment is, "I am the Lord thy God. You shall have no other gods before me," which, depending on how you read it, implies there are in fact other gods. But it was this premise that it existed in a large part of the time in the Old Testament, that there's Yahweh, or or Elohim, or Adonai. There's a whole bunch of names that get used that or I've seen argued that may have at one point been different deities, but this God is the God of the Jewish people. You worship him because he's your God. You don't worship Moloch, for example, because he's the god of the Canaanites. Canaanites worship Moloch. Jews worship Yahweh. It's not that Moloch doesn't exist. He's just not your God. It's almost, I think, I'm trying to think of a way of explaining it. It's almost actually like the idea of a patron saint or a patron angel. You have a specific angel, you have a specific saint that protects your country, and you go to him when you have something. Now, when the country is in dire straits, over another one because his job is to watch out for you. This is a whole much longer discussion and actually it's an idea that you get into in the Psalms, where it talks about a council of gods that Yahweh sits at the head of. But there is an argument, a biblical argument that can be made that there is something more henotheistic going on in the Old Testament, where Yahweh is the chief of a council of gods, and each god is given the job to watch over a group of people. So arguably, to put it in modern terms, Yahweh, there's a supreme creator who created Zeus and Athena and Aphrodite and all of those gods. And those gods' job is to watch over the Greek people. He created Odin and Thor and Heimdall and all those gods, and their job is to watch over the Norse people and so forth. And you're not wrong to worship those other gods. They're just servants in a greater pantheon at which the Jewish God is the head. But again, this is a very complicated topic that I can barely touch on. It's more of something for a theologian to get into, but it is very interesting. And certainly, again, there's ample evidence that, depending on which period of biblical history you're talking about, the Jews would have at least acknowledged the existence of other gods, if not outright worshipped them, as well as at one point they were. At one point, it's thought by a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists that Jews were in fact polytheists that gradually moved towards monotheism. Granted, even modern Judaism, depending on which form, there's the idea of, I forget the name, so I'm not going to make a fool of myself by trying to say it, but there's the idea that there's a divine feminine principle, as well as the masculine principle that most people think of, and they may have a co-rulership position. But to get myself back on point, in all of these stories, one of the most common themes is Lilith kills children. Why she does it depends on who you ask. Certainly in the popular version that we all know, that is her anger with Adam and particularly with Eve for taking her place. Maybe she didn't want to run out. She wanted equality. She swears of vengeance upon all of their children. And then basically the three angels God sends to drag her back and make her play nice. Set up a situation when okay, so Shekinah is the divine feminine. But basically, these three angels set up a situation where if an amulet with their names on it is placed around a child's neck, it's protection from Lilith and from her children. Now, what I think is an interesting argument here, and you could look at this both from a Christian or Jewish demonological position, or you can look at it from the position of a psychiatrist or a medical doctor, looking at it from a historical perspective. We have a condition nowadays, that is medically recognized, and called SIDS. When children die in the middle of the night, and there's no medical reason for it. There's been a whole series of studies that have been done. But by and large, they've never pinned down that this is definitely the cause. Certainly a number of cases that appear to be SIDS later turn out to be cases of child abuse, and then more cases that are actually SIDS, the parents get accused of child abuse, and it's a huge mess. Now, can I say definitively that some of SIDS cases and all SIDS cases are the work of demons? No, I can't. But I'm going to put a pin in that for a second, because I'm going to come back to it with another thing that people aren't as well aware of. But what I can say is this: the phenomenon of SIDS is, I would imagine, nothing new. When babies die in the night and seem to be fine in the ancient world, they probably would have blamed demons. And this aspect of, from a purely scientific, there's no such thing as a paranormal. I think you could make an argument that the story of Lilith may have been an attempt to explain SIDS. But here's where this gets interesting. Now, with SIDS, there's a whole bunch of factors going on that we don't, that makes it impossible to definitively say it's one thing or another. But, most of the people listening to this have probably heard of or seen one or more of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. What many of you may not know is that Freddy was not an entirely original idea. Wes Craven got the idea for Freddy from primarily two sources, I understand it. One is a disfigured bum that had scared him very badly when he was a child. And the other is a very unusual, very rare medical phenomenon known as SUDS, Sudden Unexplained Death Syndrome, or sometimes known as Sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. SUDS is a phenomenon that is entirely unique to men, almost always in their 20s, and from Southeast Asia. More specifically, they're generally members of a Southeast Asian tribe known as the Hmong people. These men will die in the night with no medical cause that has ever been discovered. Medically speaking, they're healthy. They don't have heart problems. They don't. It's not some sort of seizure thing. It's not aneurysm. It's not any of these things. But it always happens at night in sleep, and they look terrified. Now the story gets more interesting and decidedly creepier. In Hmong culture, there's a name for this phenomenon. It's something they've known about for a long time. They call it a dab sog. Dab sogs in Hmong culture, they practice basically a very spiritualist form of Buddhism with nature spirits and spirits of ancestors and things of that nature. And it's widely considered a very powerful form of shamanism, arguably the most powerful form of shamanism. But they believe there are these demonic spirits that live underground that they call Dabsog. Now, normally, they perform very specific rituals at holy sites to keep the Dabsog underground. The problem becomes the Vietnam War happens. The U.S. government, the war goes the way it did. Among people who had actually, many of whom had sided with the United States, had a serious problem with the fact that a hostile new government was taking over, and the U.S. winds up relocating many of them to the United States. They relocate to the United States. They can no longer perform the rituals because they have no access to the holy sites. These men start to die. Now, here's where the common element comes into play. There's a phenomenon that is generally well understood by psychologists and psychiatrists. So there's a number of questions that have been raised about it, known as sleep paralysis. I can almost guarantee that whether you know it or not, some of the people that will listen to this video, maybe some of the people listening to it right now, have experienced sleep paralysis. To describe a classic example of sleep paralysis, you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't move. And there's this feeling of a presence in the room, some malevolent force. Some people even report seeing something. Most traditionally, they wind up seeing an old woman. They may be standing in the room. They may sit on often they sit on their chest and they choke the life out of the person. What's so interesting about this phenomenon is it's reported all over the world by a variety of names. Dabsog attacks are what I just described. Many descriptions of Lilith and the succubi are exactly as I just described. In Canada, they call it a hag attack or hagging. There are a variety of names for this phenomenon all over the world. Now, don't get me wrong. Do not get me wrong. It is never my intention to suggest or imply that mental illness is caused by demonic activity. The vast majority of cases of sleep paralysis, in my opinion, personal, non-professional, since I'm neither a psychiatrist, psychologist, nor medical doctor, but it is my personal opinion that the overwhelming majority of sleep paralysis cases, arguably all, have a medical explanation. If you are experiencing what I described on a regular basis, I would highly encourage you to consult with a medical doctor and a sleep clinic. It can be it is actually pretty common. Around 30% of the population experiences it at least once in their life. And by the way, I'm part of that 30%. But if you have it frequently, it can be a sign of a more serious sleep disorder. I had it once, which was actually on a New Year's Eve. I woke up in the middle of the night. I couldn't move. What I found fascinating is in a lot of descriptions, a very dark, shadowy form that people describe. Um, in my case, it was a bright, shining, golden figure. Still absolutely terrifying. Couldn't move, was there for a second or two, and then it just simply vanished. And I could move again. I don't think it was paranormal. Lisa said it's not psychological in origin. I'm pretty sure you're right. It's neurological, or otherwise medical. But specifically, as I understand it, and I'm by no means an expert, there is a mechanism in the body that usually prevents you from moving when you're dreaming. This is so you don't get up and walk around and injure yourself. It's a pretty logical thing. Sometimes that mechanism malfunctions. Sometimes you wake up and it's still turned on, which is sleep paralysis. Sometimes it doesn't turn on at all, and you get dreams of falling where you wind up waking up thrashing around in your bed. Both of which are very... I've woken up thrashing in my bed from a dream of falling. It's not a pleasant experience. I haven't had that in many years, though. But again, these are well understood phenomena. There are certainly questions about it, about why across cultures and time periods descriptions are so extremely similar, especially when you weigh in factors like the Dabsog attacks and the reality that we don't have a medical explanation for SUDS. Now, to be fair, because I do not want to commit the appeal to ignorance fallacy, that we don't know what causes SUDS doesn't mean we can't know or will never know, or that it automatically has to be paranormal in nature. I'm just positing it as an interesting thing to consider. I'm not claiming an expert, a decisive answer one way or the other. There's actually an excellent book on the subject called "The Terror That Comes in the Night," written by a I want to say it was a psychologist. Let me look it up because I don't want to say who wrote it and then mess it up. Here we go. The Terror That Comes in the Night, an experience-centered study of supernatural assault traditions, publications of American Folklore Society, by David J. Hufford. It's an excellent book on the subject. It examines descriptions of it in a variety of cultures, looks into some of the medical explanations. And what I like about Hufford's approach is that he's not arguing that it's a paranormal phenomenon. He's not arguing that it's a medical phenomenon. He's arguing that it's a phenomenon we don't really adequately explain. Oh, dang it. We don't really have an adequate medical explanation for that. We need to experiment on further. Bear with me 1 second. And it's not a call for this is the explanation for it. It's a call for we don't know. Let's look into it more. Lisa for Truth says some experts think the preschool. It's not a call for this is the explanation. I hadn't heard that, or maybe I had. I'm not entirely certain, but it's an interesting point. I think certainly sleep paralysis has played a role in witch trials over the centuries. Not so much Salem, because we know what was going on in Salem pretty well, but maybe some of the historical ones. Because, again, there's this commonality of experience that's been assigned to all sorts of creatures of folklore over the centuries. Certainly gets associated with witches. It also gets associated with vampires, for example. If you read Dracula, there's the one case where it talks about the dark mist coming into the room and taking form and feeding on Lucy or Mina. I don't remember off the top of my head, given how huge a fanboy I am of that book. That's embarrassing. But it is a very textbook example of sleep paralysis, and more specifically of this hanging attack phenomenon. It's, like I said, it's an interesting subject. Um, I certainly, and it's always worth pointing this out when it comes to a lot of subjects that we talk about here. Um, if you're experiencing this phenomenon, if you're waking up in the middle of the night and having this happen to you, don't assume you have a demon in your house. Talk to qualified medical professionals. Um, I have seen cases where I believe what was going on was, where what someone was experiencing was legitimately paranormal, while most of it fell into the category of sleep paralysis. There is actually a special here on YouTube, or that was originally filmed way back in 2001, um, in New York, called "The Entity of the Terror That Comes in the Night," um, where Lou Gentili, my mentor, and a certain bearded old man, or much younger man known as Kevin Mears, yes, me, investigated a case in New York. That where the subject was describing not being able to move, seeing all these bizarre and horrifying visions, and this, in my personal opinion, was not sleep paralysis for two particularly good reasons. First, we ultimately had him checked out. In fact, full credit to the Learning Channel, I want to say more specifically Banyan Productions, which was the film crew we were working with. They paid for the young man to go to a sleep clinic and be tested, and no signs of sleep disorders were found. Furthermore, when he laid in bed and had these things experiences, his girlfriend laying with him also saw things. Well, if you wake up in the middle of the night and see something really, really bizarre, that can be a sleeping disorder. There's a phenomenon that goes right along with sleep paralysis, known as a hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucination. The hypnagogic hallucinations are hallucinations that happen just before you fall asleep. Hypnopompic hallucinations are hallucinations that happen just after you wake up. It's really largely the same thing, but basically what's going on is your mind is awake, your body is awake, but you're still dreaming. This explains a great deal of supposed paranormal phenomenon. Particularly a lot of alien abduction cases fall squarely into sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations. If you read Whitley Strieber's books, for example, there's instances he talks about waking up in the middle of the night unable to move, and he looks up and his house is on fire. And even when he still sees it after he can move again, instead of trying to get out, instead of freaking out, instead of trying to call 911, get his family out of the house, he rolls over and goes back to sleep. Now, certainly, if you don't fall back asleep, if you freak out, which is a very rational response to seeing your house on fire, it doesn't mean that what's happening is real. But on the other hand, if you see something horrifying and disturbing just before you fall asleep or just after you wake up, and your response is to roll over and go back to sleep, there's a really good chance that some part of your brain is aware that what's going on is a dream. And all three of these are, again, if you're having these experiences regularly, it's an excellent sign to get yourself checked out, because it can all be signs of sleeping disorders, particularly, for example, narcolepsy. Both these types of hallucinations and sleep paralysis are common symptoms of the disorder known as narcolepsy. Again, I'm not giving medical advice here. It's friendly advice. If you're having I'm not a doctor. Don't take this as doctor's advice. I'm just saying it's good. Even if you have reason to believe something paranormal is going on in your house, it's still worth getting checked out by a competent doctor. If you have something paranormal involved going on in your house and you actually need an exorcism, God forbid, the church is going to want you to go through the medical testing to begin with. And just because there's something legitimately paranormal in your house does not mean you can't be suffering from a sleeping disorder. The two are not mutually exclusive. So just get yourself checked out. and again, a lot of the times, the sure sign is if it's independently verifiable. Are other people seeing the same thing? Can you videotape it? Can you audio record it? Can you can you some way as objectively as possible document that something unusual is going on? Because you cannot videotape hallucinations. Um, you cannot audio record hallucinations. Which is where an investigator like myself gets involved. Is like, okay, can we document this? It's also why we prefer to record things, not simply witness them, because my witnessing something can be explained in any one of a number of ways without me lying. And for that matter, lying is always a possibility. When it's recorded, when you have it documented, it becomes that much harder to explain. And again, these are all things that are going to be in consideration if you need a priest. They're going to want more than, well, I saw. So if you go to a legitimate investigator like myself, or if you go to a priest and say, I woke up in the middle of the night to see a demon sitting at the foot of my bed, leering at me, and I couldn't move, and that's all you had happen, we're not going to tell you that you need an exorcism, for heaven's sakes. And here's another thing, and this is something that's always worth repeating with a lot of these types of conditions. That you are suffering from sleep paralysis, that you're suffering from hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, does not make you crazy. It arguably doesn't even make you mentally ill. Again, 30% of the population experiences this at least once in their life. Certain types of personalities, particularly fantasy-prone personalities, and certainly Strieber qualifies, which is not an insult. Fantasy-prone personalities. I'll come back to your question in a second, Lisa. But fantasy-prone personalities often write excellent fiction. But when you have this very fanciful, very vivid imagination, you tend to have some weird things happen. Now, Lisa for truth says, I've seen ghosts on, like, Ghost Asylum. Is that real or CGI? Or is it like Mist or something? Because we're both prone to look for faces. I'm not personally familiar with Ghost Asylum, but I know the sort of photographs you're talking about that looks... and I imagine you can get them on film too, though I've never actually videotaped it. But you'll get these pictures of what looks like mist. And sometimes the mist will have what appears to be faces in it. Now, there's a real neurological phenomenon called pareidolia, which I suffer, Lisa suffers, and everyone else listening to this suffers from. It's not a disorder. It's the way our brains are wired to work. Which is, we tend to see patterns. Our brains are designed, as a turn of phrase, I'm not saying that God, I'm not invoking intelligent design here, but as a turn of phrase, our brains are designed to look for patterns. This can be a very, very good thing. If you're in the jungle, being able to recognize and spot patterns might very well be the difference between running, getting away from a predator and being a tiger's next lunch. The problem is we also see patterns where there are no patterns, which is pareidolia. The most famous example that almost everyone has experienced. And I'm going to tell you how to experience pareidolia real simple. And you probably have already done this. On a nice sunny day when there are clouds in the sky, lay on your back in a field and look up at the clouds. Any of them look like anything? Birds, bunnies, I've seen ones that look like dragons. That tendency to see shapes in clouds, that tendency to see faces in mist, all can be pareidolia. Is every picture of mist pareidolia with faces in it pareidolia? No, I don't think it is. There's a whole series of questions that come up, mostly relating to what's the source of this? Excuse me, of the mist. Is someone smoking? And there's a real, often an easy enough way to tell because cigarette smoke, when photographed, often turns blue. Um, I don't know why, but I've seen more than enough photographs of it to know it's true. Not always. Sometimes you take it, it just looks gray, but it often looks. If you're looking at mist or smoke on a camera and it's blue, probably the first thing to ask is, "Are you a smoker?" Another real common one is breath. Um, Obviously, on a cold night, you can see your own breath, and you can photograph it. A real common thing to look for this is you'll see little dots in the mist. What those dots are is they're ice crystals forming because of how cold it is outside. That's not always the case. A night with a very high dew point, your breath may still show up on film. Another real common thing that will cause mist to show up on film, mist. You can photograph mist from time to time. But there's ways of counting, if you're on an investigation, there's some tips when you're taking photographs. One, just before you, and this is actually a tip that professional photographers also use for different reasons, but it's still a good tip. Hold your breath when you take a shot. Two, don't smoke in the area you're doing an investigation. Because, the night that you do an investigation, you take a photograph with a digital camera around when people smoking, you see this weird mist-like phenomenon. You're going to go, oh, that's just smoke. 10 years later, when you're looking through your camera footage, you may forget that and go, oh, look, we've got evidence. So just don't, if you're doing an outdoor if you're doing an investigation in a house, go outside to smoke. If you're doing an investigation outside, pick a designated area away from where the rest of the investigation is taking place to smoke. Or, and I know this is downright heresy to smokers, but you can wait till you get home. Wait till you're driving away. Just a thought. Be aware of weather conditions. If it's a cold, damp night, mist is not that strange. To have show up. And don't jump to assume that just because you see a face in mist, that it's a ghost. It might be a ghost. It might be your brain looking for patterns. This is also true of a lot of other types of evidence. If you're playing back an audio recording, you may hear you hear what sounds like a voice saying something. It could be a voice. It could be your brain seeking patterns and hearing a voice saying something. A good counter to that, I would suggest, is play the recording from multiple people and just ask what, if anything, they heard. If you play the same recording for 10 different people, and they all say, I hear a man saying, get out, or a woman saying, help me, maybe you got something there. Check what you think you see and what you think you hear against other people's perceptions. Different, especially it's all, and this is another important point that I've talked about in other videos, and it's worth repeating. It's important. It's important not to close your mind to the possibility when doing an investigation, because refusing to accept the possibility of the paranormal isn't going to help. It doesn't mean you have to believe in it, but you have to at least consider the possibility. Be open to the possibility that you're wrong. But if you're a believer, be open to the possibility that you're wrong. I believe that there are haunted houses in the world. That does not mean that I believe that every house that people think is haunted is actually haunted. It is very easy to get paranoid and start jumping at shadows and see spirits everywhere. You don't want to do that. You want to be as aware of natural phenomenon as you can. you want to do research, you want to learn as much as you can about photography, it's never a terrible idea to bring a professional photographer with you. Um, you know, or if you don't know one you can bring, ask a friend of yours who's taking courses of photography in school, hey, can you tell me what's going on here? Because this doesn't make sense to me. And they may look at it and go, that's lens flare, that's this, that's that. You know, your camera's busted, go buy a new camera. Um, which leads to another excellent piece of advice. If the camera you're using to take photographs on a case has a strap, cut it off. Or at very least, wrap it up around your hand and keep it as far as it possibly can be from the lens. By the same token, keep your fingers as far as you can from the lens. I have seen competent, reasonable, rational people get overly excited only to be embarrassed later when they realized that string of ectoplasmic energy they thought they got on film was the camera strap. Or that weird amorphous blob of light was their finger. And we've gotten off the topic of Lilith, but that's okay. Where am I at, time-wise? Does anybody have any questions? I'm probably going to wrap up shortly because I've covered what I wanted to cover. And it is 9:30 at night here. But hopefully this was an interesting look into things for folks and give you a little bit different of a perspective instead of the story that everybody thinks they know. It's worth noting in a broader sense, there's a misconception I've run into from time to time among non-Christians, particularly some pagans, that the idea of demons is something unique to Christianity, or unique to Judaism. Never mind the people that think Judaism and Christianity are just interchangeable terms with the same religion. They really aren't. But like I said, there's this concept of the dab song. Among people, there are a number of demonic beings that are talked about in Babylonian mythology, folklore, and various magical books. Lisa for Truth is absolutely right. Buddhism has demons. Buddhist demons can be very, very interesting. Particularly, there's a figure in Buddhism known as the Mara. Hold on, let me double check that name because I know there is definitely. Oh, actually, for that matter, that was something I should have mentioned when I was talking about sleep paralysis. To give people an idea of how far back this idea of being attacked by demons in your sleep goes, there's there's a type of demon that in Old English known as a Mara. Mara does everything I described as, sitting on your chest, choking the life out of you. You can't move. Always attack you at night. And particularly the attacks gives you bad dreams. This is where, of course, English gets the word nightmare. Oh no, it is actually, I was right, it is Mara. So there is a figure in Buddhism called Mara, who is often associated with the devil. Although, it's actually a lot more interesting than that. Basically, Buddha goes through his meditation underneath the Bodhi tree. And he's tempted by this being known as Mara. He's tempted with worldly delights. He's tempted with the things that he desires. Because, of course, if you know anything about Buddhism, and if you don't, there's a video far enough back on my channel where I go into all this. But in Buddhism, the idea of understanding and controlling your desires is what you want, is what you need, what you're trying to do. Not necessarily eliminating all desire, but just being aware of what you desire and controlling that desire instead of letting it control you. But, well, yes, Mara tempts Buddha and tries to dissuade him from this path to enlightenment. Mara still has a place in the natural order, and Buddha recognizes this, and Buddhists recognize this. it's that place of the earthly pleasures. Certainly, there's also the Buddhists have this concept of hell, called in a number of Buddhist countries Naraka, but it's not. There are certainly concepts of demons in cultures other than Christianity. It's just worth noting that the concept, often very similar, is not identical. Just like Buddhists tell, there is a Buddhist fiery hell where you're tortured with flame. It is the low of the. I want to say there's 3 Buddhist hells. It's the worst of the ones for the worst and most grievous of sinners. Those who kill their parents, those who kill a person who has reached enlightenment, someone like a Buddha, basically. And I want to say there's at least one other symbol that sends you there. And you spend a very long time in that hell, longer than the other 2. But it's a finite hell. You do get out of it. It's not eternal damnation. Just like in Babylonian mythology, there are a number of gods that are very dark. Pazuzu is a god of disease, as in inflicting disease, not just as in healing disease. But he also protects children from evil spirits. It sometimes it's not as simple. It's just because it's similar to Christianity or Judaism doesn't make it identical. Although granted, with Babylon and Sumeria and the Assyrians and the Canaanites, there's a number of places where things overlap just by virtue of the fact that these cultures all lived in the Middle East, and they're among the oldest civilizations in the world. They affected each other considerably. I mean, keep in mind that when people talk about the Talmud, the book that is a commentary on the Torah, the one they're talking about generally is the Babylonian Talmud, which is also where you get this idea of the first wife of Adam. And a whole bunch, it's definitely, if I can find somebody, and actually somebody comes to mind I might talk to, but with someone more qualified than it would be an interesting talk about how older cultures influence Judaism. Because there's undeniably influence there. I mean, among other things, some of the biblical law is very similar to the Code of Hammurabi, as I understand it. Which is a common argument I've heard, is that people tend to think that U.S. law is based on the Bible, and it's like, it's probably it's influenced by older law codes that are, and following it back, they're actually arguably more influenced by the Code of Hammurabi, which is the oldest of all. It's the oldest formally recognized code of laws, though apparently they have found other systems of laws that are slightly older. And for that matter, Christians think of the story of Noah and the flood. There's a very similar story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written about 1,000 years before the Bible. And that itself is in turn based on older Assyrian stories of, again, of this worldwide flood. And you see tons of other things of this sort. For example, in Hinduism, there are deities known as devas, and there are demons known as Ashura. In Zoroastrianism, there are the deities known as Ashura and demons known as Deva. I'm pretty sure it's not a coincidental naming convention. But now we're treading well into more comparative mythology, and I'm getting further and further out of my depth. We're also gone well beyond the original topic, which is okay, because I find all of this interesting. I'm going to wrap this up. I do want to recommend folks that you might want, if you've enjoyed this, I would recommend checking out Lisa for Truth's channel. She has a lot of very interesting videos about various religions and about the history of religion and things of that nature. It's good stuff. I really quite enjoy it. There are another one out there that's worth looking into is what's the name of it? Digital Hammurabi, with Dr. Josh, who is a Syriologist, I want to say, but he knows infinitely more about the mythology of the ancient world than I can even pretend to come close to. And he's also co-hosts Skylar Fiction's channel, which is one I've been lucky enough to appear on a few times, or twice now, I should say. It also was worth checking out. But that's going to do it for tonight, folks. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed my content in general, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing it with your friends. If you have a little bit of money that's burned a hole in your wallet, you can go to our patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology, and support us that way. Times are tough, money is difficult, so again, the most helpful thing you can always do is just subscribe if you haven't already. That's going to do it for tonight. I want to thank you all for watching. This is Kevin Mears, your Paranormal Encyclopedia, saying good night and God bless.